Take a moment to review these facts from our previous lessons about Christianity from Christ to the end of the first century, the early New Testament Christian church. Struggle for purity, the early church would face enemies from within. Jesus himself had warned in Matthew 7:14, "Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." One of the biggest struggles that the early church faced was the dilution of the Christian faith, and that from within. This took many forms, such as legalism, as well as Gnosticism. There were also struggles against inadequate views of Christ and the Trinity, the true nature of the Godhead. Deuteronomy 6:4 states, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The New Testament describes Jesus as God and the Holy Spirit as God. Now, during the 2nd and 3rd century, most Christians affirmed the monotheism of the Old Testament while also affirming the full deity of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. However, could the incarnate Christ be God without impacting and affecting the divine oneness of the deity? This was the driving question. 4 attempts to solve this problem were eventually put forth and rejected as being inadequate. Allegory, which denied Christ was the Word, the expression of God. No Trinity, since God was one, and it said Christ was a great teacher, but he wasn't God. There was adoptionism, which said Christ was simply born as a man and God adopted him. Jesus was adopted by God in a special way, according to this theory, and members of this group could not agree among themselves as to what this adoption meant or looked like. It says that Jesus was adopted at his baptism and the divine power left him on the cross, where he had stated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" No doctrine of the Trinity is necessary in adoptionism. There's also subordinationism, where Christ was divine but subordinate to the Father. No need for a doctrine of the Trinity in this theory as well. While Christ was divine, he was lesser than the Father. And then modalism, that Christ is just another name for God. The Father left heaven to become the Son, the incarnate Christ. When the Holy Spirit was given, heaven was emptied again. All three are simply the one God. Of course, none of these theories are correct or orthodox teachings. After the first century, most converts to Christianity were Gentiles or pagans. They brought with them many of their former ideas, and they began to creep into the theological marrow of the Christian movement. One such pagan corruption was fetishism. It's a devotion in the magnification of importance of religious objects and acts. The bones of saints, religious possessions, the sign of the cross being a pious act. Christians began to judge their faith by religious acts and relics. Another pagan corruption was sacramentalism. Baptism and the Lord's Supper were now called sacraments, and the word for sacrament is a Latin word which means a military oath. It carries the ideas that the physical elements or act carries the means of salvation and spiritual grace. Another corruption was sacerdotalism. This word means priestism. Not only the Jewish tradition, but all the ancient pagan cults included priests and rituals. The making of the sacraments into magical instruments of grace meant that they must be delivered by those who are qualified and trained in the art of those magical practices. Thus, only under the supervision of the bishop could the instruments of salvation be administered. Professionalism was another corruption. This is where Christianity adopted a hierarchical system, clergy versus laity, and even within the clergy there was a hierarchy of those who have been called to lead and those who have been called to pastor. A division among the church. We also see the beginning of Mary worship during this time. Every pagan religion in the ancient world had its female deity. Converts from those systems emphasized the role of the Virgin Mary. She became an object of adoration and worship. 3 distinct but overlapping movements appeared during the first several centuries in reaction to these lowering of standards. All 3 insisted that the majority church, the church at large, had allowed unworthy persons to administer and receive the sacred ordinances or sacrament. Between 135 and 160, Montanus, a recent convert from the pagan priesthood, denounced Christians in Asia Minor for following human leadership rather than the Holy Spirit. He charged them with following Gnostic ideas. Montanus emphasized 2 distinctive doctrines. One, the Holy Spirit. He claimed to be the Holy Spirit, and thus his words were authoritative, and he emphasized eschatology, calling for Christians to separate themselves from the world, that Christ was coming shortly to begin the millennial reign in the Frisian villages where he was preaching. During the worldwide persecution of Christians under Emperor Decian, many Christians fled, denied their faith, or surrendered scriptures. Once persecution ended, many returned to the church. This created a problem, though. What do we do with these apostates? 2 schools or solutions arose. 1, allow them to return to the church if they met certain conditions, or 2, they should never be allowed to return. Novatian was the leader of the strict party and withdrew from fellowship with the lenient party, led by Cornelius, Bishop of Rome. Novatian was elected the bishop in North Africa. He founded many churches that followed this leadership of not allowing the apostates to return back into the church. The Donatism controversy saw the same issue that the Novatianists were dealing with, but with one important caveat. It concerned the validity of the baptism or leadership of a bishop if he had apostated to the desires of the state. It asked the question, is his baptism effective, as well as any other episcopal rites he administers? The strict party insisted that when a bishop is personally unworthy, that is, having denied the faith under persecution or surrendered scriptures, or has been consecrated by an unworthy bishop, any ecclesiastical act of that bishop is invalid. In other words, an unqualified bishop or priest was unable to administer saving baptism. The Donatists claimed to represent the true line of episcopal succession and were qualified to administer, and only they were qualified to administer, saving baptism as well as other episcopal rites. A visible and very impactful new direction for Christianity is emerging as we transition from the apostolic era to the early church 1st century, 2nd century era of the New Testament Christian church.